Okay, today I want to do four things, right? So we're beginning to talk about Kant. And first of all, I'd like to remind all of you that since we're reading Kant in translation, it's important that we're all reading the same translation. In particular, we should all be reading the Mary Gregor translation that's published by Cambridge University Press. Fortunately for you all at UCL, all of these are, all of that book is available online via Cambridge Core. You can access that through the library. I would also recommend that you take a read of the introduction by Christine Korsgaard. Christine Korsgaard is a well-known ethicist. She's profoundly influenced by Kant, and her introduction to the Mary Gregor translation is very useful. I realize it's optional reading, but I think you might help you find your feet with this material. Okay, so let me talk about the four things that we'll be doing today. First of all, I'm going to talk about the project, the overall project of the groundwork. Um, uh, then I will talk a little bit about the first issue that comes up in the first section, namely the nature and value of the goodwill. Uh, the third thing I'll talk about is uh, Kant's avowed methodology announced in the preface, and whether or not it's consistent with his discussion of the free will. Uh, and then finally, we'll look at a supplementary argument that Kant provides. Now, just so you know, even though the goodwill looms large in the beginning of the first section, right, it's not really the primary focus, okay? As we'll see, Kant will go on and he proposes to explicate the concept of the goodwill by considering the related concept of duty. Uh, and it's that discussion that gets us to a formulation of the moral law. The reason we're talking today about the goodwill is so that because it's essential background for the discussion of duty, which is really the primary focus of the first section. Okay, so uh, let's begin here. Um, All right, so Kant's project in the groundwork is the search for an establishment of the supreme principle of morality. Uh, that's a fancy name, but sometimes he'll refer to it in shorthand as the moral law. Um, Now, there are two questions that are asked in the groundwork. First of all, well, what is the supreme principle of morality? And the second, does the supreme principle of morality in fact exist? Now, the first question, uh, what is the supreme principle of morality, is answered in the first two sections of the groundwork. The second question, does the supreme principle of morality exist, is only ever answered in the third section. Now, the first section provides a provisional answer, right? The supreme principle of morality is represented by the formula of universal law. Doesn't matter if we don't know what that is right now, but that's going to be the answer given in the first section. Now, the second section is going to provide us with a more complete answer, right? Uh, The supreme principle of morality is represented by a system of three formulas, two of which have uh, variants. Okay. Um, hang on a second. All right, so two of which have variants. Okay, so the first formula, now at this point, we're just trying to understand the overall structure of the groundwork. So it doesn't really matter if we understand what any of this stuff means. But the first formula of the formula of universal law is going to read, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, it's going to have a variation, the formula of law of nature, and it's going to sound very similar, but it's crucially different in a certain way. And it reads, act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. It's the second formulation of the first formula that Kant is going to really develop and apply in the second section. The second formula, the formula of humanity, many regard this as emotionally resonant and difficult to apply. However, if you look at Kant's later ethical works, this is the main principle by which he derives specific duties. The formula of humanity reads, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. The third formula, we have the formula of autonomy. And look, he doesn't actually express this in the same way he expresses the others. He describes it as the ideal of a will of every rational being as a will giving universal law. And finally, we have the formula of kingdom of ends, which is meant to be equivalent to the formula of autonomy, act in accordance with the maxims of a member, giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. Now, what's all this stuff? Now, the important thing for us to know at this point is that these three formulas aren't distinct principles. They're meant to be three different representations of one moral law. Okay. Now Kant makes some interesting claims, and we'll see the point of these claims as we talk about Kant, but it's useful to have them before our mind at this point. The first claim is that, well, look, for appraisal of an action, right? If you just want to know whether an action is morally permissible, right? Kant thinks that you should just, the first formula is the most useful, right? He thinks that we can more or less tell right away whether or not acting on a particular maxim is going to be permissible just by applying it to the formula of universal law. Now, he goes on to claim, however, that for access to the moral law, and it's unclear at this stage what that could possibly mean, the three formulas should be applied to one and the same action, thereby bringing the moral law closer to intuition and thereby feeling. Now, whatever access to the moral law amounts to, it's at least going to involve forming a strong desire to act as the moral law dictates. Okay. Okay. Now, the conclusion of of the first two sections are conditional, right? The conclusions of the first two sections are going to take the form of, well, if the supreme principle of morality or the moral law exists, then it must have a certain character, okay? So the conclusion of the first section is, if the supreme principle of morality exists, it can be represented by the formula of universal law. The conclusion of the second section is going to be, well, if the supreme principle of morality exists, it's going to be represented by this system of three formulas, okay? Now, the existence of the supreme principle of morality is really only established in the third section, okay? So we don't discharge the antecedent, the if part of the conditional claims of the first and second section until we get to the third section. There, Kant argues that the supreme principle of morality, as represented by the formula of autonomy, is only valid for the human will, just in case that will is free, and that in order to act at all, right, the freedom of the will must be presupposed. Now notice, Kant isn't really demonstrating, right, that the existence of the supreme principle of morality. So rather, right, he argues that we must presuppose that such a thing exists if we are to act at all, okay? Right. Now, the first section of the groundwork opens with a startling pronouncement. Kant writes, it's impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation, except a good will. Wow, that is a remarkable claim. Now, he seeks to elicit our assent to this startling pronouncement by comparing the goodwill with other goods. Okay, so here we have the other goods that he's going to be comparing the goodwill to. They divide into two classes. There are gifts of nature and gifts of fortune. Gifts of nature, they're going to include things like that he describes as talents of mind, understanding, wit, and judgment, and what he calls qualities of temperament. These are so-called secondary virtues: courage, resolution, perseverance. There are others. Gifts of fortune, right, however, aren't necessarily things you're naturally endowed with, like intelligence, but rather things that you can acquire. So gifts of fortune include power, riches, honor, and health, and happiness, understood as complete well-being and satisfaction with one's condition. Now, gifts of nature, according to Kant, are not unconditionally good. He's not claiming that they're not good. They are, but he is claiming that they're only conditionally good. That is to say, they're only good under certain conditions. And the reason he thinks that is because he thinks that gifts of nature can be evil and harmful by a will if the will that makes use of them is not good. So even secondary virtues such as moderation, self-control, calm reflection can be extremely evil if used by a bad will. So Kant illustrates this by asking us to consider how the coolness of a scoundrel not only makes them more dangerous, but more abominable. Now, just as gifts of nature are good, but conditionally good, similarly, gifts of fortune are good, but only conditionally good. They're not unconditionally good, but they're only good under certain conditions. Thus, gifts of fortune can be evil and harmful if the will that makes use of them is not good. Now, even the value of happiness is conditional on the person's possession of a goodwill. And Kant gives two arguments for this. They both run by pretty quickly, but I think they're worth spelling out for different reasons. Okay, so the first argument, Kant claims that happiness can corrupt. So happiness has a tendency to produce boldness or even arrogance. And Kant's thought seems to be this. Given human nature, persons have a tendency, when happy, to believe that they deserve to be happy, whether or not they in fact deserve to be happy. Moreover, in appropriate circumstances, such an arrogant delusion, right, can lead to imprudent action and even moral evil. However, a goodwill can correct the corrupting influence of happiness by acting on principles that are consistent with the moral law. Now, what's interesting about Kant's first argument here that that happiness can corrupt is that there's recent empirical research that suggests this. Now, we don't now have presently a fully adequate empirical criteria for happiness. However, the criteria we have work reasonably well, and over a number of studies have shown that happy people tend to be more cruel than unhappy people, thus vindicating the Kantian claim that happiness can corrupt. Doesn't mean that it will invariably corrupt, it just means it just has this natural tendency. Okay, the second argument for why happiness is merely conditionally good, right? It's good, but only good under certain conditions, namely when possessed by someone with a good will. So the second argument is this. Kant says, and this goes by, I think, in just a quick line. Kant says, prosperity and happiness of a person without a goodwill can give no pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. Okay, what I want you to see about this argument is its sentimentalist form. Remember Hume. Remember Hume's sentimentalism, right? Something's going to be virtuous or vicious if it produces pleasure or pain from the general view or survey, right? Sometimes that's characterized by his student, Adam Smith, as whether or not a impartial, rational spectator, right, can is pleased or not. Okay. Now, Kant, like Hume, was influenced by Hutchinson, who was an early sentimentalist. And indeed, in Kant's earliest writings about ethics, he himself, like Hume, is a sentimentalist, although in the work we're presently reading, he's converted to rationalism. Okay, so that's what's interesting about this second argument. It has it takes the form familiar from sentimentalism. Okay, so from these two arguments, happiness can corrupt, and an impartial, rational spectator won't be pleased by seeing someone who lacks a goodwill being happy. From those two arguments, Kant concludes that a goodwill seems to constitute the indispensable condition even of worthiness to be happy. Well, okay, so far we've seen his arguments that, or his claims that the gifts of nature and fortune are not unconditionally good, but are good only under certain conditions. What are the conditions under which a gift of nature or fortune is good? Well, according to Kant, the value of the gifts of nature or fortune are conditional on their use by goodwill. So unlike gifts of nature or fortune, the goodwill is unconditionally good. The value of a goodwill doesn't even depend on what it accomplishes, let alone its fittingness to obtain some independently given end. Okay, so here's Kant in a very famous passage. He says, even if by a special disfavor of fortune or this will should wholly lack the capacity to carry out its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should achieve nothing and only the goodwill were left, uh, uh, not of course as a mere wish, but as the summoning of all means insofar as they're under our control, then, like a jewel, it would still shine by itself as something that has full worth in itself. Usefulness or fruitfulness can neither add anything to its worth nor take anything away from it. Its usefulness would be, as it were, only the setting to enable us to handle it more conveniently in ordinary commerce, or to attract to it the attention of those who are not yet expert enough, but to recommend it, but not to recommend it to experts or determine its worth. Okay, so even if a goodwill lacked the capacity to carry out its purpose, maybe because it lacks the requisite gifts of nature or fortune, it would still have unconditional value. Moreover, right, the value of a goodwill is incomparably higher than the value of happiness and presumably any other gift of nature or fortune, no matter how valuable they are. The goodwill is more valuable than any individual gift of nature or fortune, no matter how valuable they are on their own terms. Indeed, it's more valuable than any aggregate of gifts of nature or fortune. So no combination of health, wealth, happiness, and so on is in aggregate more valuable than a goodwill. So the value of a goodwill will outrank the value of gifts of nature or fortune, no matter how valuable they are in isolation or in aggregate. So we see that the goodwill has got three features. Goodwill's an indispensable condition for the value of other goods, right? It's a precondition for them to be good. The goodwill is the only kind of thing that is unconditionally good. And the value of the goodwill is incomparably higher than the value of any other thing, whether in isolation or aggregate. Now, we're not told a whole lot about the goodwill. And indeed, at this point, he only offers us a formal characterization of it. He says that the goodwill acts consistently from the principles of pure practical reason, and so corrects the influence of gifts of nature or fortune by adjusting their use to universal ends determined by pure practical reason. Well, we don't know what pure practical reason is at this point, nor do we have an idea about what universal ends are. However, right, this might remind you of the formula of universal law that we'll come to. Um, uh, Now, the interesting thing about this characterization is it's formal, since we don't know what these principles of pure practical reason are. And so we don't know how persons with a goodwill will actually behave. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about the value of the goodwill. Now we're going to go on to our next topic, right? In particular, we're going to look at the methodology that Kant has set for himself in the preface for the first section. And we're going to do this because it raises a question about whether this discussion of the goodwill is actually consistent with it. Okay. So in the preface, Kant describes the argument of the first section as a transition from common rational to philosophic moral cognition. That's a mouthful. Well, we'll have to unpack that. So we can begin to understand Kant's strategy given this discussion of the goodwill. Now, what is common rational cognition? Okay. Importantly, it is not common sense beliefs about morality. Common rational moral cognition is instead unreflective, practical knowledge of the rational standards that are at use in moral reasoning, moral judgment, and in action. Okay. So common rational moral cognition is, first of all, unreflective. Why? Because it's not based upon reflection. Common rational moral cognition is practical since it consists in knowing how to act in accordance with such principles, right? So it's a kind of know how as opposed to knowledge that. Kant writes, let's see, there is accordingly no need for science and philosophy to know what one has to do in order to be honest or good and even wise and virtuous. Okay, why? Well, because he thinks this involves, again, unreflective practical knowledge. You can know how to be courageous or know how to be honest without any kind of theory, right? So it's unreflective. And since it's know-how, it's practical knowledge. So common rational moral cognition is a pre-philosophical knowledge of rational standards that every rational being must use in moral reasoning, judgment, and in action. And since it's pre-philosophical, common rational moral cognition is subject to, according to Kant, philosophical clarification and sometimes correction. Now, let me point out something because there's a connection here with Hume. Like Hume, Kant is a kind of moral conservative, right? He takes it for granted that we more or less know right from wrong. They differ, however, I think, in the portraits they provide of human nature. Hume provides us with a realistic, an optimistic, if realistic picture. We get a bit darker picture from Kant, but they, again, both assume that, look, we more or less know right from wrong. Contrast that position with the position of the biblical prophets. They're notoriously angry. And part of the reason they're so angry because they think that the people around them have no clue whatsoever about what's right and wrong. That's not Hume and Kant's positions. Okay. Now, uh, um, um, now Kant's strategy in the first section is to convert this pre-philosophical knowledge that we all more or less possess, this unreflective practical knowledge, into reflective theoretical knowledge. That's what he means by the transition from common rational moral cognition to philosophic moral cognition. We've got this unreflective practical knowledge. We know how to be honest, say, or good. Okay. We know how to be honest or good, uh, um, but perhaps we don't understand exactly what that means, right? We don't have reflective knowledge of this. This is what he's trying to achieve in the first section. Now, notice the startling pronouncement that inaugurates the first section of the groundwork raises a question about the strategy. And let's just remind ourselves of this startling pronouncement, right? He says it's impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will. Okay, now that's not an ordinary moral claim. It's not a moral claim that every person possessing common rational moral cognition would immediately assent to. Indeed, this seems to be a philosophical claim, which, if true, would represent reflective theoretical knowledge. So this raises a question. Has Kant abandoned his avowed strategy right at the very beginning? Well, to see that he hasn't, it's important to recognize, and I've mentioned this before, but it's important to underscore how common rational moral cognition is not common sense beliefs about morality. Kant thinks that many of our common sense beliefs about morality are wrong. Okay, so for example, moderation in affect and passions, self-control, and calm reflection, he writes, seems to constitute the very inner worth of a person, but they're not good without limitation in the way that the good will is. There, Kant is casting doubts on certain Stoic ideals that remained popular even today. Common rational moral cognition is not commonly held beliefs about morality, but rather, again, our unreflective practical knowledge of rational standards involved in action. Now, indeed, Kant thinks that he can appeal to such unreflective practical knowledge to elicit our assent to his initial pronouncement by asking us to compare the goodwill to other goods and to register the verdicts of common rational moral cognition in each case. Now, Kant's procedure here is avowedly Socratic, and this is Socrates pictured here alongside with Kant. He writes, without in the least teaching it anything new, we only, as did Socrates, make it attentive to its own principle. This is an allusion to the Meno, where Socrates gets a slave, an uneducated slave, to um, uh, 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 um, uh, to describe certain truths of geometry. And the point of that was that, well, just through questioning, the point of that was that there's a sense in which we already kind of innately know things, okay? So the point of moral philosophy, according to Kant, isn't to teach us something that we didn't know, but rather make us to attend to the principles by which we implicitly act all the time, even if we're not fully reflectively aware of the content of such principles. Now, gaining this knowledge is not only theoretically significant, but importantly, it's practically significant as well. So, common rational moral cognition is a kind of innocence. And while we may appreciate innocence's splendor and even regret its passing, when it does pass, innocence, according to Kant, can't protect itself well and is easily seduced. Okay. The problem with operating merely with common rational moral cognition is that we're easily tempted to act for the wrong reasons, and this can lead to not only imprudent action, but moral evil. Now, since common rational moral cognition is incapable of guarding itself against evil, Kant thinks that even common rational moral cognition can recognize the practical motive to philosophically theorize about rational standards. Why? Well, because Kant thinks that if we have a certain reflective theoretical understanding of the moral law, will form naturally a strong desire to act in accordance with it, right? So, how might philosophy help? Well, Kant seeks to gain reflective theoretical knowledge of the moral law as somehow or another grounded in our free reason. Okay. So again, we more or less know right from wrong, even if we're often tempted to act for wrong reasons in ways that we may not be aware. What we lack, however, is an awareness of the moral law as rooted in our free reason. Such an awareness elicits a strong desire to act from the moral law, and so functions as a corrective to temptation. So the knowledge that Kant seeks is not knowledge of right or wrong, that we more or less already have, but knowledge of what we desire as free and rational beings. So the knowledge that Kant seeks is a kind of self-knowledge, and insofar as this self-knowledge elicits a strong desire to act in accordance with the moral law, it is potentially transformative of our moral character. Now, in a way, this is a manifestation of Kant's pietist background. Kant is in the groundwork is looking for a reasonable form of moral reflection to check the purity of our motives. Such a form of moral reflection is practically necessary since, again, without it, we are easily tempted to act from wrong reasons. Now, despite conforming to common rational moral cognition, Kant claims that the unconditional value of the goodwill can still seem extreme. Now, remember, he's trying to get us to assent to the startling pronouncement about the value of the goodwill by getting us to compare it with the value of gifts of nature and fortune, where our verdict is supposed to be just based on our common rational moral cognition. But even so, he thinks maybe this isn't as persuasive as it should be. And this leads us to our fourth topic, which is the supplementary argument that Kant gives, right? Now, the argument appeals to a teleological conception of nature. Now, under the first bullet point, following the colon, that's actually a quote from Kant. He writes that nature endows its creatures with no capacity unless that capacity is best suited for achieving its purpose. Okay, for our purposes, right? That's all we really have to know about the Kant's teleological conception of nature. Well, what's the purpose of reason? Okay, well, according to Kant, it's not to secure happiness. Why? Well, because securing happiness would have been easier to do and more reliably done by endowing us with the appropriate instincts. Okay. Now, happiness, right, is a matter of our needs and desires being satisfied, right? So nature could have made it really easy for our needs and desires to be satisfied by maybe equipping us with the appropriate gifts of nature, or perhaps by restricting the number of needs and desires that we have. At any rate, endowing us with reason is not a terribly reliable way of securing happiness, right? And from that, he concludes that nature doesn't endow us with reason for the purpose of securing happiness. Well, if nature endows us with reason, not for the purpose of achieving happiness, well then, for what purpose does nature endow us with reason? According to Kant, nature endows us with reason, again, not for the purpose of achieving happiness, but for the purpose of achieving a good will. So reason, according to Kant and Pache Hume, is a practical capacity. It influences the will. So in a world where nature distributes its capacities and endowments in a purposive manner, the purpose of having reason must be to produce a will that is good. Now, Kant's argument here is not demonstrative. Nothing in it rules out the possibility of there being other candidate purposes, but Kant thinks that having eliminated the purpose of happiness, he's eliminated really the only relevant alternative, right? The best candidate, the best alternative candidate to his preferred answer. Okay, I want to draw our attention to one detail of the discussion in this part of the groundwork, because it involves a very kind of distinctive idea of Kant. So Kant's going to draw an important distinction between the highest good and the complete good. Now, the good will is the highest good, given that it's the indispensable condition of all other goods and its value is incomparably higher than all other goods, right? The good will enjoying the happiness appropriate to it is the complete good. So imagine someone with a good will where all their desires are more or less satisfied. Not only are they going to have the highest good because they possess a good will, but they're going to enjoy the complete good because not only do they possess a good will, but all their wants and needs are satisfied, right? So the goodwill is not the complete good, right? Since a person can have a goodwill without being happy. Nevertheless, nature can attain to its highest purpose by endowing us with a capacity for achieving a goodwill, even if the likelihood of achieving the second purpose, happiness, is, as Kant dramatically puts it, less than zero. Okay, so we've been talking about this um, supplementary argument. In a way, this discussion complements the pietist theme in Kant's moral philosophy. Nature endows us with reason for the purpose of achieving a good will. Notice, a good will is not a gift, right? Like the gifts of nature and fortune, right? It's not something that's given to us. It's something to be achieved through the exercise of reason. Now, one interesting feature of this supplementary argument is its theoretical nature, right? The discussion thus highlights a potential limit to Kant's avowed strategy for the first section. Kant claims to begin with common rational moral cognition, but look, the appeal to a teleological conception of nature surely goes beyond this basis. That is to say, a commitment to nature endowing its creatures with no capacity unless that capacity is best suited for achieving its purpose seems not to be part of a commitment of unreflective practical knowledge, okay? Though again, maybe this is just another manifestation of Kant's pietist background. That is the way in which unreflective practical knowledge of rational standards has to be supplemented by reflective theoretical knowledge in order to avoid corruption and to resist temptation. Okay. I want to end today by talking about a diagnosis for human evil that that Kant is going to give us. Okay, and you will see. I think it's important for us to have that in front of us, right? Because it'll be clearer about how this theoretical knowledge is supposed to help resist our temptation. And in particular, it's going to see how the formula, it'll help us to see how the formula of universal law, right, if we have it explicitly represented and before us, can help us do the right thing. Okay, so what is Kant's diagnosis for human evil? Again, Kant, like Hume, thinks we more or less know right from wrong, right? You don't need science or philosophy to teach you how to be honest or good. That you more or less already know, right? What science or philosophy can teach you is to have an explicit awareness of the implicit principles upon which you act. Okay, so we all more or less know right from wrong. Well, why are we tempted to act for wrong reasons? Well, Kant thinks that because of our, as he puts it, inclinations, right? And think of these as tendencies to act on the basis of our passions or desires that are somehow rooted in our bodily nature. Because of our inclinations, we've got a tendency to make exceptions for ourselves. Okay, suppose, I don't know, you're in an embarrassing situation and you lie your way out of it. Okay, now Kant thinks you don't, when you lie, you're not thinking, hey, lying is right, right? You think lying is wrong, right? Only just this instance, I will make an exception for myself, right? So the diagnosis for human wrongdoing has to do with a tendency to make exceptions, special exceptions for ourselves uh, to universal law. Okay. So if lying's wrong, it's wrong for everyone. But we find ourselves thinking sometimes, well, look, I know this is wrong, but maybe just this once, right? Or just this once. Uh, Now, that's an interesting thought, okay? Uh, because, it doesn't make wrongdoers into monsters, right? Rather, right, again, when someone lies, they don't think lying is right. They think lying is wrong, but, maybe just this once, you know, because of the situation I'm in, I'll do it, okay? Uh, so if wrongdoing involves making an exception, right, to the universal moral law, right, then if you have a representation of the moral law that's going to emphasize its universality, right? It's going to be a very useful reminder to someone endowed with common rational moral cognition who's tempted to make an exception just this once to universal moral law that look, that's not going to fly. Okay. So that's, I think, a really interesting insight in very interesting diagnosis for wrongdoing, but it also will help us to appreciate how the formula of universal law can be a useful corrective when we're tempted to act for wrong reasons. Now, we've talked today about the goodwill. Uh, that looms large in the beginning of the first section, but that's not its real topic, right? He's going to go on to further validate these claims about the value of the goodwill by considering the related concept of duty, right? Uh, he describes it as explicating the value of the goodwill by considering the related concept of duty. It's that discussion of duty that's the interesting bit. Why? Because the conclusion of it is going to, of that discussion, is going to give us the first formulation of the supreme principle of morality. So this material about the goodwill is really there as a setup for this argument we get for how the moral law is represented by the first formula. Now, so there are really two reasons we are talking about the goodwill today. First, right, because it's important background for the argument that we're going to begin discussing next time, but also the notion of unconditional good and conditional goods, it's a really important topic. Later writers, even those who are by no means influenced by Kant, for example, Joseph Ras, when writing about the nature of value, draw these distinctions. So it's a really useful distinction for us to have under our belt going forward in the study of ethics. Okay, so here's what's going to be happening, right? Uh, um, uh, we're going to, for the next two lectures, I believe, or perhaps it's the next lecture and a half, uh, be talking about the rest of the first section, about the related concept of duty. And our goal is to see how we get to this representation of the moral law. And I'll talk about some problems for the first formula. And the problems I will talk about uh, aren't there so much to be dismissive of Kant but rather will motivate the importance of the discussion in the second section. So we're going to be living with the first section, which is only, I don't know, 20, 30 pages for a couple weeks. So far today, I've really only talked about the preface and maybe the first few pages of the first section. Um, and we'll talk about duty beginning next time. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks everyone.